So happy Easter, everyone. This is a beautiful and a delightful time of the year. And what we want to talk about this morning is just a couple things. We want to take a look at the Easter messages that we get from the New Testament, and we want to take a look at it metaphysically. We want to kind of go beyond the literal interpretations, and we want to make it personal. We want to understand, but what does this mean to me in terms of my growth? You know, as I said a couple weeks ago, Emmett Fox would tell us that the Bible is a book of spiritual psychology, and what he meant by that was it describes the different states of the soul, and that we can recognize and we can relate to each and every character in the Bible because there's a part of our psyche, a part of our soul, there's a part of us that recognizes that sees that. We understand the Pharaoh consciousness and the Moses consciousness and the Christ consciousness and the Pontius Pilate consciousness and the Judas consciousness. There's a part of us that can relate to all these different characters, and what they're doing is they are playing out a drama, if you will, teaching stories. That what they're doing is they are pointing us toward our next step. No matter where we are on this path of self-discovery, of discovering the self with a capital S, the self within, no matter where we are, we can find, as we look into the sacred texts of not only Judaism and Christianity, but of the world religions, we can look into the texts and we can find something that we can relate to at our current level of consciousness, and we can find something that gives us that aha, oh, yes, I understand a little bit more. We find that little nudge that kind of moves us forward, and that's what we want to do today. We want to take a look at these scriptures of the New Testament. We want to take a look at them and say, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to the growth of my soul? What is it trying to tell me about what God is and what I am in relationship to God? And I think a couple things that we've got to look at is, first we have to understand that as cultures collide, so to speak, as societies bump into one another. Remember, there was a time when the world wasn't so populated, and the only time that people came in contact with one another was when they were kind of wandering around chasing the same herds. But then people settled down, and they had to actually build walls around their cities for the first times because other people would come and take what they had. And since that time, what has been happening is one culture kind of merges with another, blends with another through a mutual, arrangement, probably a friendly arrangement, or perhaps through warfare, through one society dominating another. But whenever one society kind of comes into contact with another, there's an interesting phenomenon that takes place if you go back and look at it, and that is the mythologies. The mythologies being the sacred stories, the stories that contain the valuable moral teachings of that society. A myth doesn't mean a lie. In our culture, when you say something is a myth, we typically mean it is a lie. And that is one definition of mythology. But the other definition of mythology is it is a story, a teaching story that contains the deepest held beliefs of a society. And every society has creation myths. It's very important for people to understand, how did we get here? What are our beliefs about that? And that is what is contained in the creation myths. And every society has a myth about how fire came to be domesticated, because it's a very, very important part of life. So as the cultures would kind of blend and merge together, what tends to happen is the mythologies get blended and merged. But the essence of what the mythology is trying to teach, the moral lesson, the valuable belief that is there, doesn't change very much. The form that it takes may change, but the essence of what is being taught doesn't change very much. For example, Before the Catholicism came to Ireland, in the Celtic religions that were there, Bridget was a very important goddess in that religion. And after Catholicism came, they couldn't quite displace this idea of Bridget. They couldn't displace everything that Bridget stood for. But what they did was they replaced her with Saint Bridget. So instead of Bridget, the Celtic goddess, now we have Saint Bridget, the Catholic saint. And the ideas associated with the symbol, right? The symbol that what Bridget represents, of the health, of the healing, of the guidance, of the love, of all of the different beliefs that people would incorporate into symbolism, it continues on. So it continues on, and it takes a slightly different form, and it takes a slightly different way that the story is told. But the essence of what the story is trying to teach, it is still there, and it is still valuable. And if we can understand that, if we can step back far enough, we can then look at the different mythologies. We can then look at the different stories, the different teaching stories. And we can say, what is the essence of what this is trying to teach me? What is the essence of where this is pointing my soul? How can I use this as inspiration and motivation and education and guidance to allow me to continue to move forward? Another thing to consider is that in the religions of the people who were agricultural, who lived on the land, they were typically goddess religions, and they were more in tune with nature and reproduction and the crops and the birth of the animals and cooperation, collaboration, and all those sorts of things. And in the religions of the hunter-gatherers, they were typically male-oriented religions. They had gods instead of goddesses. And the gods were warlike, and they had enemies, and they gave the adherents permission to go out and conquer and to slay the enemies. And you constantly see in history, you constantly see where a god, a male-dominated god religion, kind of overtakes a more passive agricultural society, a goddess-dominated religion, and tries to put down the religion. This is why we're told that things are just old wives' tales. It was the way of the god religion putting down the goddess religion. It's a bunch of old wives. Don't pay any attention to them. They were putting down the teachings of the native goddess religions. But this idea of what the goddess represents, the symbolism of the feminine, is such an important part of what we are that we can't deny it. We can't hide it. We can kind of push it down and try to make it go away, which is what the god religions try to do. But they can't. So here in the center of, for example, Christianity, we have the symbol of the Madonna and the child. The goddess has come back, kind of at a different station, if you will, a different position in the mythology, but there nonetheless. And if you look at the images in Christianity, if you look at the images of the Madonna with the child, of Mary with the baby Jesus on her knee, and you go back to the Egyptian religions which predated Christianity, and if you look at the images of Isis with her baby on her knee, I can't remember if it was Horus or Osiris, but Isis with her child on her knee, it is the same image. It is the same symbolism. It is representing kind of the same things to us. And I point that out because when we get to looking at the symbology, if we get to looking at what we're being told in the Christian New Testament about Easter, we kind of have to look at the symbolism and say, well, what is that telling us? What is that telling us about our lives, and what is that telling us about the growth of our souls? So just remember, as cultures kind of come together, that the mythologies combine. And as they come together and combine, the essence of what they are trying to teach us remains very much the same. It may evolve slightly, which it should. It should evolve slightly and move our understanding forward. But still the essence of what these things represent remains pretty much the same. So we can look across cultures, we can look across time, we can look across religions, and we can find the good wherever we go, because the good is there. See, the good, we didn't create the good. Humanity did not create it. It is the very essence of what the divine is, and therefore the very essence of what we are. But we can uncover it and we can discover it. We can roll away the stone of the things that are blocking us from finding the good, from experiencing good, from expressing the good that is already there. So if we look a little bit then about this time of the year, the springtime of the year, when the Easter comes to us in the northern hemisphere, it is traditionally a wonderful time of celebration throughout history, throughout different cultures, and throughout time and space. It is there. In the Germanic religions in Northern Europe, the goddess was Oester, and in the Old Testament it was Esther, Esther. And here it is called Easter, but it always comes around spring. It always comes around the equinox. Of course, in Christianity, the Christian dates for Easter follow Passover in Judaism. Remember, it was Passover when Jesus was coming into Jerusalem. As we talked last week, everybody was coming into the temple for the Passover festival. And Passover was set by the lunar calendar. Easter is traditionally the first Sunday following the first full moon, right? We just had our blood moon or eclipse moon. The first Sunday following the first full moon following the spring equinox, the vernal equinox. And that's traditionally how Easter is set. And for people who were agricultural, for people who planted, they planted by the moons. I don't know if anybody remembers reading the almanacs. You can still get them, but when I used to garden, I used to get the almanac all the time, and it would tell you, based on what phase the moon was, what seeds to plant at that time. And some people dismissed it as superstition, but I viewed it as being an accumulation of practical wisdom, that people knew that there were certain times of the year that you could plant certain seeds and they would do well, and if you planted them at other times they would not. And the way that they kept track of time was by the moon, by the phases of the moon. So Easter comes to us at a time of traditional celebration around the world. And what was being celebrated in all of these different cultures through all of these different times is the return of life, the very return of life in spring. Winter has passed. Winter is gone. Everything that was brown is turning green. Everything is starting to flower and to blossom, and the young animals are starting to be born, and you can hear the birds starting to sing. Yesterday I was working in my office, and I started to whistle a happy tune. I get music stuck in my head, and I had a tune stuck in my head, and I started to whistle it. And I stopped, and right outside my window, a cardinal had come and landed on the hedge. I guess it heard me whistling. And the cardinal was sitting on the hedge and whistling back at me. So I would whistle and the cardinal would whistle. And we were mimicking one another, going back and forth. It was just absolutely amazing, to realize the presence of life and life responding to itself. And that is what the springtime is all about. And it's even more than just that celebration. It is the fulfillment, if you will. It is the fulfillment of the expectation that people had at the winter solstice. Remember the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. The sun is gone for longer than any other day of the year when the winter solstice occurs. And people would have these solstice celebrations to celebrate the fact that the days were now getting longer again. And they knew at that time, that by virtue of the fact that the days had started to grow longer again, that the inevitability of spring was there. that life had promised, so to speak. Life had promised to return. I shall return, like Magartha. Life had promised to return. It was going to come back. And here we get to the spring, and now it is back, and it is time to celebrate. It is time to dance. It is time to feast. It is time to enjoy the beauty of the flowers and all of life. And this is what the Easter traditions are about. The Easter eggs, that we have and that we dye in different colors, they're signs of prosperity. They're signs of bounty. They're signs of abundance. They're signs of much life to come. And the egg, if you think of the egg as being a perfect example of life knowing what to do, inside this egg is everything that little chick needs to grow. Everything. There contained in the yolk is enough food to sustain that chick as it evolves from this little glob of gooey stuff that if you crack open an egg and it runs all over the place, and somehow through the miracle of life, through the magic of life knowing what to do, that grows in there. You can't see it growing because it's inside the egg, but it grows in there nevertheless. And it grows and it grows and it becomes alive. And it takes on a life of its own. This little blob, this little gelatin mass, this little slimy stuff that's inside the egg takes on a life of its own, and it gets feathers, and it gets a beak, and it gets toes. And at some point, when the time is right within, when it knows, there's an inner knowing or an inner guidance or an instinct, but when the time is right, that chicken pecks a hole. From the inside out, it pecks a hole. And it opens the shell, and it emerges into the world. It rolls back the stone of the tomb that it had been contained in, and it emerges into the world. And coloring the eggs, dyeing the eggs was a means of celebration. And it indicated that life is going to return. Life has returned. Life reproduces itself in abundance. If you look at the nature around us, what we get is abundance, abundance, abundance. Everything is just blossoming in abundance. The pollen is just abundant everywhere. The symbol of the rabbits, the bunny rabbits, of course, is they're prolific. They reproduce rapidly. They represent life growing and thriving. And this is what Easter is about in the symbolism of the non-Christian traditions. It is a celebration of a new beginning in the cycle of life. And if we take that and we recognize that the Easter tradition, the stories that were told about the death and the resurrection of Jesus, are superimposed upon that backdrop of the celebration of the return of life, the celebration of new beginnings and of new life and of God's bounty and of God's abundance and of prosperity, now we start to take on perhaps a deeper meaning for our soul of what the Easter stories are all about and what they're trying to tell us about. That the story is not just about a person who lived a couple thousand years ago. The story is about you and I. The story is about the evolution of our own soul. It is about us awakening to the very presence of the divine within, the Christ within. Right? The Christ is the point where the human and the divine come together. That we awaken to the very presence of the Christ within, and we come out of our tomb, we come out of our cave, we come out of our imprisonment in the material world. And now we come forward in recognition of our spiritual nature. Up until that point, we may have lived primarily as humans or entirely as humans. But something began to awaken with us. The Christmas experience, the beginning, the birth of the idea that the presence is within. And now the presence has grown, you see. If we follow the scriptures, they tell us, of course, that we kind of hear very little. From the time Jesus is a baby, we hear about him when he's 12 years old, and he says, I have to be about my Father's business. And we're told that he grows in wisdom and understanding, and then suddenly he emerges almost fully grown. He has his public ministry for a few years, and the world is starting to recognize what it means to have the presence of the Christ in its midst. Now again, that's our story, that's your story, and that's my story, that's every person's story. That there comes a time within us that we become aware, just vaguely aware of the presence of the divine within. Right? We didn't create this life. We didn't create ourselves. We wouldn't know how to do it. We don't know how to beat our hearts by ourselves, but there's something within us that is caring for us that does that. We become aware of that as a little glimmer, as a small child, as a babe, at the Christmas experience of our life, whenever that may be. It doesn't have to be in December, but whenever that is, we get this glimmer, you see, and it starts to grow, and we nurture it and we nourish it, and we study, and we pray, and we meditate, and it begins to grow into maturity, and it starts to emerge in our lives. It starts to become visible in our lives. We start to become more and more aware of it, and then we come into this experience I talked about last week, the Palm Sunday experience. We're just so delighted that it is there. We're just so happy that it is there. We want to celebrate it. And then we come to the crucifixion and then the resurrection. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what is that about? What does that symbolize for us in the growth of our soul? And what tends to happen to us, as I said last week, is we become aware that we are more than what we have realized up until that point of our lives. We become aware that there is a presence of God or the divine or spirit or love or whatever you choose to call it, but it is present. And it is present in us and as us, and we didn't put it there, and we can't make it go away. We can try to hide it, we can try to stuff it down, we can try to pretend it's not there, but nevertheless it won't go away. It's the poet who said it is the spark that can be desecrated but can never be destroyed. It is there. It is within us. It is there. And it grows. And we become frightened of it. See, the way that I look at the scriptures leading up to the crucifixion, it is that the status quo, the power structure, is threatened by the presence of the Christ, the presence of the divine. The new king has arrived. Just as at the Christmas narrative, Herod sent out his troops to slay the infants under 2 years old, which never really happened, but is there in that story to teach us that the ego gets afraid and feels threatened by the presence of another power. Now we come to the other bookend. We come to the crucifixion story, and instead of Herod, we have Pontius Pilate, and we have Judas, and we have the masses screaming, "Crucify him, crucify him." And what happens is we start to recognize that if we are to submit, to surrender, to allow the presence of the divine to grow within us into the fullness of maturity, then what has to happen is the old ways have to go. The old familiar ways have to go. The ego has to go. The status quo has to go. And we might not be quite ready to do that. It may frighten us. So we have in the context of the New Testament stories, we have Jesus entering Jerusalem at a very, very difficult time in history, a very tumultuous time in history. The Romans are there, and the Romans are large and in charge, and they lead by being brutal. Anyone who looks as if he or she is going to cause trouble is someone who is immediately put down, quickly and brutally and crucified. We have this time of celebration of the Passover where we have an opportunity, if you will, for violence, where you have a large number of people together and they must somehow be controlled. There must be order. There must be some way to keep them together. We have the Roman military and the Roman governor watching this situation with careful eyes. And in the midst of this, we have Jesus arrive. And Jesus comes in, we're told he comes into the temple, and in the temple there are the buyers and the sellers. So what happened was as people came into Jerusalem for the feast, they had to make specific offerings at the temple. And they came from different parts of the country where there was different currency. And the only currency that would work in a temple was the temple currency. So there were money changers there. And people had to come and they had to exchange whatever money they had for whatever money they needed. And they had to buy doves and they had to buy certain things in order to make offerings at the temple. And this set up kind of a flea market or a bazaar kind of atmosphere in the outer chambers of the temple. And in those days, the vendors, they didn't have, like you go to a flea market today, people have folding tables out there with their stuff on it. In those days, the vendors would carry their wares up on their shoulder. They had a large wooden tray that set up on their shoulder, balanced on their hand. And they carried their goods on it. When people came along, they would take that wooden tray down, show the people their goods, and conduct business. And in this environment, Jesus comes and he is offended because the temple should be about spiritual growth. It should be about discovering the presence of God in our midst. And instead, people have turned it into a business. And this upsets him, and he goes around and he pushes the trays off of the shoulders. And he creates a disturbance, which is, with the watchful eye of the Romans, which is the kiss of death, so to speak. So he is branded as a troublemaker and a rabble-rouser, and he must be controlled. And the Romans offer a reward for anyone who will turn him in, and Judas takes them up on that. But if we look that far in the story, we can see that what happens is in each and every one of our lives, you see, there is that which wants to be in control. There is the ego. There is the power structure. There is the intellect. There is our idea about the way things should be, and anything that threatens it, we need to get rid of. And then we have emerging within us this idea that what is really within us is way beyond our control. It is the presence of the divine itself. It is the love of God itself. It is something we call the soul or the spirit that we don't understand, and we can't touch it and we can't feel it. We can't weigh it and we can't measure it, but by God it's there, and it frightens us. And as it starts to grow in our lives, it makes us aware of things that are going on in our lives that we probably should let go of. Ideas that we have that do not contribute to our growth. It upsets the apple cart, if you will. It upsets our status quo. Well, if I'm going to live my life truly as a spiritual being, does that mean that I need to change the way that I do business, or to change the way that I vote, or to change the way that I think of certain other people? And all of these things, of course, the answer to those is yes. And all of these things that we start to become aware of, that maybe the way that we are conducting our lives is not the way that the Spirit within us suggests. We believe in lack and limitation. We believe in power and struggle and politics. We believe in all of these things, and the Spirit within us tells us something entirely different. So we try to look for ways to make it go away. That's what the Judas within us represents. And of course, Pontius Pilate represents the ego that wants to sit in judgment. So the story goes on, and then we have people who are part of the status quo who say, we've got to figure out how to get rid of this man. So they take Jesus to Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate tries to pretend that he's not responsible. Remember, he washes his hands and he says, "I don't have anything to do. This is really not my affair. I shouldn't be having anything to do with this." And our ego tries to do that. Our ego tries to make decisions, and it pretends that it had no other choice but to make those decisions. Watch our politicians at work. Watch them when they go and do something and say, "We had no other choice but to do that. We really didn't have any other way but to do that." And of course, they did have another way. They just chose to discount all of the other ways until they got to the one that they wanted. And then they said, "Well, we didn't have any other choice." And this is what Pilate is representing to us in here. And Pilate is saying, "Well, I don't know that, I don't know, maybe this fellow isn't so bad after all." So our ego is kind of dancing, is kind of playing, but knowing the whole time how this is going to play out, knowing the whole time how the crowd is going to turn, if you will. So the way that the story goes is Pontius Pilate brings out Barabbas, and Barabbas is an insurrectionist. He's a revolutionary. And if there's one thing that Pontius Pilate and the Romans did not put up with, it was insurrectionists and revolutionaries. They were threatening the very establishment itself. They were anti-government. They were trying to overthrow the government. There is no way historically that Pontius Pilate would have come forward and said, I'll give you this man, here, I'll let him go. There's just absolutely no way that could happen. There's no record of any such feast or any such tradition of the Roman governor pardoning a prisoner for the holidays. This is a story. This is a story that is contrived to teach us something. So what we tend to do is we tend to bargain. We tend to say, well, what is it that you really want? Do you want to keep your spiritual nature, or do you want to keep your physical nature? Do you want to keep believing in life as a strictly physical proposition, as a proposition that perhaps you understand how it works, you understand the Machiavellian power of how it works, you understand all of these things even though they may not be entirely what your heart is telling you to do? Or do you want to accept your spiritual nature? Do you want to allow the humanity to be crucified, or do you want to have the spiritual nature crucified? And of course, the story goes on to tell us that the crowds are shouting out, to crucify Jesus, crucify Jesus. Excuse me. And what it's telling us is that our ego, your ego and my ego, that at times that we're given that choice, we're not quite ready to accept the fullness of our spirituality. So what we'll say is, give us back our humanity, give us back our Barabbas, give us back the things that we're familiar with, even though they're troublemakers. Give us back to them. Give them back to us. And we'll let the spiritual go away for a while. Now, one thing I just want to mention here at this point, it's very important, because here the scriptures are blaming all of this on the Jews. And it has the Jewish crowd saying, "His blood will be upon us and upon our children and our children's children." And this is something that is written into the stories, because when Christianity started to spread, up until 66 A.D., Christianity was more or less another branch of Judaism, so to speak. So Peter and James, James the brother of Jesus, they stayed right there in Jerusalem, and they kind of viewed Christianity as being another branch of Judaism. They wanted the Christians to be circumcised and to follow the strict Jewish diets and those things. But after the Romans destroyed the temple, they essentially destroyed Judaism as it had existed as a religion of the temple. And Paul was there, and Paul wanted to take Christianity to the whole world. Paul said, this isn't a message just for the Jewish community. This is a message for everybody. Well, Paul wanted to take Christianity into the Roman world. And he couldn't quite go into the Roman world and say, yeah, you understand that God sent his son here to earth and you people killed him. It would have been a tough sell. So there had to be somebody else to blame, and this is what is written into the scriptures, and it is so unfortunate because it has led to thousands of years of brutality and anti-Semitism and the Crusades, where the Crusaders were on their way from Europe to the Holy Land to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims, but they would just happen to stop at the Jewish communities along the way and trash them as well. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, that's why that is in there. That's why that blaming the Jews for Jesus' death. That's why that is there, so that Paul could go into Rome and bring Christianity to Rome. So we're back now to the crucifixion, and what we find is we find Jesus is on Calvary, and there's a good thief and there's a bad thief. And again, that is symbolic. We have one who is willing to accept the suffering without any hope of salvation, total belief in the physical. We have one who wants complete release from suffering without any accountability or responsibility for what he has done. And in the center we have the Christ, which is the perfect blend of the human and the divine, the perfect blend of the physical and the spiritual. And if you look at the image of a human being with his arms stretched out horizontally, what we're told by the theologians is to consider that the upright, the vertical line would represent the will of God, and the horizontal line would represent the will of man, or we might say the human and the divine, and the place where they intersect is at the heart. So the Christ is at the heart level. Right? The Christ consciousness is something that doesn't come to the intellect. It is something that comes through our intuition. It comes at the heart level. In Buddhism, the heart chakra is represented by two triangles, one pointing up and one pointing down. Right? Below the heart chakra, we are concerned strictly with physical things. Above the heart chakra, we are concerned with spiritual things. And at the heart chakra is where the two meet. And if you look at what the symbol of one triangle pointing up and one triangle pointing down overlaid on top of each other, you come up with the Star of David. So these different cultures and these different religions throughout time are trying to tell us all kind of the same thing, that it is when we stop dwelling in the purely physical world, when we start to enter the world of love, that we become opened and awakened to our spiritual nature. The Buddha consciousness, the Christ consciousness, the David consciousness of love. So here what we have is we have a representation that what has happened is that the ego, the status quo, the mob mentality that represents our human consciousness was not quite ready to accept the fullness of its own spiritual nature and tried to kill it, tried to crucify it. But what did it crucify? And it crucified the flesh. It crucified the physical. It can't kill the spirit because it didn't create the spirit, you see. So now we have the flesh is put in the tomb, and it stays in the tomb for 3 days, and a big stone is rolled in front of the tomb, Now keep in mind that the stone is also a literary device that is put there for a reason, because any power that could raise a dead body back to life would surely not have any trouble with a stone, you see. But the idea was that after Christianity started to spread and people said, well, his followers just came and took the body out of the tomb, they wrote back in the story, oh no, there was a big stone that was put there. Oh, and there was guards that were put there too. Everything that was kind of written in to kind of answer objections to the story. But we're not looking at the story from a historical level only. We're looking at it from a spiritual level. But now here you have the Christ back in the womb, so to speak, enters the world through the womb of Mary, and at the very end is in the sealed tomb. And it was a virgin tomb, by the way. No one had ever been buried in it before. So you get the symbolism, you get the bookends. And then something happens. You see, something happens. The spiritual can no longer be denied. The spiritual can no longer be contained. It can no longer be put aside. And the stone gets rolled away. And there's a resurrection in that the spirit, which never died, which could never die, The Spirit is now fully alive. Something also very important in the scriptures, if you read the different narratives, you'll find there's a difference in the stories. Excuse me, literally they don't agree with one another. And in one version of the story, the first one to come and find the risen Jesus is Mary Magdalene, right? The goddess, the feminine, the love, the harmony, the peace that is represented by the goddess, by the feminine within. That is what discovered the Christ. It was only later when the early church was trying to promote its authority through Peter, that Jesus made Peter the first pope and so on, that they changed the narrative around, so they made it so that Peter was the first one who discovered the risen Christ. But it was Mary. In the earlier Gospels, it was Mary. So what this is telling us, what this is all coming about to tell us, what we want to consider is that there is a great deal of mythology, a great deal of symbolism, and it is important to us because it speaks to us at a level that the intellect can't reach. That is what I think is so important. The intellect can't go there. It is beyond thoughts. It is beyond words. It is a knowing that is ineffable. It is just there, you see. And what it is trying to tell us is that there comes a time within each and every one of us that our awareness of the presence of God within us, around us, through us, in all of nature, coming forward as life, blossoming on the trees, greening the grass, that starts to push its way through us in a manner that we can no longer deny. It is there. It is just so obvious we cannot deny it. It is just there, you see. And the question becomes, what do we do with it? Do we get frightened of it? Do we try to make it go away? Do we try to crucify it? And in so doing, what that means is that eventually we have to crucify and let go of all of our ideas of I'm only human. All of our mortal ideas. That's what we have to put up on the cross. That's what we have to let go of. Now, it can be a struggle. It can be brutal. Or we can just learn to let it go. We can just learn to release it. Whichever way we choose to let go of all of our ideas of lack, of limitation, of mortality, of being only human, the human only part of us must die. It must go away. It must dissolve. It is an idea whose time has come and is gone. We needed to evolve our human identity so we could get past it to our spiritual identity. Another way to put it is that we needed the intellect to take us from being driven completely by our emotions, and the intellect did that. But now it's time for the intellect to go so that we can be driven completely by our spiritual nature. And that eventually for each and every one of us, that Easter experience, that resurrection experience, that coming into the new life as a spiritual being must occur. Excuse me. To each of us in his or her own time, it must occur. Just as surely as the winter solstice predicted the spring, for each and every one of us, that glimmer that we have at some point in our life, that we are more than just flesh and blood, must lead us to rolling back the stone, to coming forward in the fullness of our spiritual nature. And we have to let the love within, the harmony within, the intuition within, to lead us to that discovery. So this Sunday, we're not just celebrating eggs and bunny rabbits and resurrections. We are celebrating the awareness of the presence of God in its fullness in each and every one of us. You are the presence. You are the love. You are the power. Let go of everything that has been keeping you enclosed in the tomb and let that come forward. And so it is.